In the early morning of June 6, 1944, over 175,000 Allied troops aboard 6,939 ships assembled along the coast of Normandy, France, the greatest invasion armada in history. Aboard the transport ship, the SS Empire Javelin, 200 young men of Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, nervously waited to board their assault crafts. After over 20 months of intense training, they had been selected among the 15,000 American GIs of the 29th Division to spearhead the dangerous and critical assault of Dog Green Sector, Omaha Beach. They were known as the Suicide Wave, and among them were 30 young men from the small Virginia town of Bedford. And by that afternoon, 19 of them would be dead. The Bedford Boys were in a regional Virginia National Guard unit together before the war. Many joined to make extra money during the hard economic times, but also enjoyed the camaraderie it provided. In many cases, they were brothers, cousins, neighbors, and schoolmates. They were happy to play soldier a few times a month and spend time with their friends. None of them expected to go to war, but at least they'd all be together. The 29-year-old company commander and Bedford native, Captain Taylor Fellers, felt personally responsible for his men. He was an ambitious and disciplined leader, but commanded more intimately than any other officer in the 116th Infantry. He had grown up with many of the men under his command and knew that Bedford would be looking to him to bring its boys home. He had studied the plans for Operation Neptune intensely, and the more he learned, the more doubt he had that any of them would survive. Days before the invasion, he was in the hospital with a bad sinus infection and was declared unfit to lead Company A. Rather than abandon his men, he checked himself out of the hospital so that he could return to his company before they loaded on their transport ship for France. Fellers said, "I trained you. I'll die with you if it comes to that." 24-year-old Sergeant Roy Stevens recalled seeing Fellers appear before the men early that morning. It lifted their spirits to have their leader back. It seemed like the men fell into two mental groups, those that already knew that they were going to die, and those that hoped to make it through. Roy spotted his twin brother, Ray. The two were inseparable, but for the first time since joining the National Guard together in 1938, they would face their greatest test alone, arriving on Omaha Beach in different boats. Now more than ever, Ray needed all the encouragement he could get. Many Bedford boys were wishing each other luck and shaking hands, so Ray held out his hand for Roy to shake, but Roy refused. Hoping to give him confidence, he said, "I'll shake it in Vierville-sur-Mer at the crossroads above the beach later this morning." Ray was quiet and looked down. He held out his hand again and said, "I'm not going to make it." Of course he would. Roy again refused to shake his brother's hand. He'd do it after they crossed Omaha Beach. 28-year-old Lieutenant Elijah Ray Nance, like many others from Bedford, joined the National Guard in 1933 out of necessity as much as patriotism. Like his cousin, Taylor Fellers, Nance felt equally responsible for the men and always gave them his best. He grew up with many of them and trained them to be excellent soldiers. He even censored their love letters to girls he knew back in Bedford. Before they embarked for France, Fellers had confided in Nance, telling him that very few officers and men of Company A would come back alive. They were being sent to face certain slaughter. Minutes before boarding their assault craft, Nance and Fellers both stood on the deck, looking out to sea. Nance remembered, "We didn't say a word to each other. I guess we'd said it all." Company A was called to its boat stations. British LCAs hung over the side of the Empire Javelin, suspended from davits at the same level as the deck. Since they were landing on Omaha Beach first, they didn't have to climb down nets to the waterline with their 60 pounds of equipment. Groups of 30 men were assigned to 6 boats. Fellers was in the first, Ray was in the second, and Roy was in the 5th. An additional 17 men, including Nance, went to a 7th boat that would land 19 minutes after the others with vital communications equipment. The water was rough, worse than expected. Waves violently slapped against the side of each assault craft as they weathered the 12-mile journey to shore. It didn't take long for the men of Company A to be wet, cold, and seasick. 5 miles out, the line of 6 LCAs passed a group of LCTs carrying the tanks destined for Omaha Beach. They were making very slow progress in the rough seas and had not launched their DD tanks. Captain Fellers noted that they were supposed to be ahead of them leading the first wave, providing cover and firepower essential to destroying German positions. There was no turning back now. They would have to manage without them. Hopefully the craters from the morning bombardment would provide much-needed cover. Slowly the shore started to take form in the distant fog, and sporadic mortar and artillery shells splashed around the assault craft. Suddenly, Roy's landing craft struck a submerged obstacle and began to sink about 1,000 yards from the shore. The LCA quickly disappeared underneath the 30 heavily equipped men, leaving them stranded and struggling to keep their heads above the water. Roy could barely swim. Weighed down by 60 pounds of kit, as well as an assault jacket he couldn't get rid of, he gulped seawater between desperate breaths before grabbing hold of a floating Bangalore torpedo. Roy and 4 other Bedford boys watched the remaining 5 boats carrying their brothers and friends continue towards the beach without them. They'd have to wait to be picked up on their return. Company A's objective was to eliminate enemy opposition and secure the D1 draw, a vital exit from the beachhead for subsequent waves of troops bound for Vierville. Unfortunately for them, the heavy cloud cover that morning made distinguishing targets difficult, and many aircraft and ships directed their fire further inland rather than risking accidentally dropping ordnance on the Allied landing craft waiting offshore. In some places, the German beach fortifications were completely untouched. At 0630, Fellers' LCA closed into the shore. He expected to see craters blown all along the beach from the planned bombardment preceding the landing, but there were none, and the bluffs above looked unharmed. They were alone and completely exposed. The armor-plated door leading to the ramp opened. Fellers stood, exited, then clambered down the ramp. His men filed after him. They waded through the water with their rifles above their heads, splashing onto the beach in a long line, then laid down on a slight incline. They were 250 yards from the D1 exit. All along the bluffs above Omaha, veterans of the German 352nd Division lay in wait. They had moved into the area in recent weeks, relieving the inferior 716th Division. They totaled 2 regiments, almost 2,000 men. As Fellers and his men started to advance, German officers finally ordered their men to fire. Above the Vierville draw, the 352nd opened up with at least 3 MG-42 machine guns and several mortars. Dozens of snipers lurked in nearby trenches and fortified houses. The slaughter was fast and ruthless. Fellers and the 29 men in his boat died in a matter of minutes, riddled by machine gun bullets from several directions. They had landed right on time, exactly on target, one of only a handful of units to do so. So they received the fire intended for a much larger force. 19 minutes after Company A was decimated, Company B and an LCA carrying Lieutenant Ray Nance and the other Company A headquarters staff, including 2 more Bedford boys, reached the shore. The ramp dropped, and Nance jumped into the water. A wave crashed down, almost submerging him. He waded forward with his rifle above his head, his soaked pack weighing him down. The next thing he knew, he was lying winded on the cold sand alone. Nance looked around. He couldn't see any other men from Company A. Bodies lay strewn across the beach, bumping against each other, all along the shallows. He realized what happened to the rest of his company. Behind him, most of his men didn't make it off the assault craft. Feeling terribly isolated, he struggled up the beach. Nance spotted 4 men huddled closely behind a steel tank obstacle and yelled for them to spread out. The words had barely left his mouth when a mortar round landed right on top of them, killing 3 of the men and severely wounding the other. Nance recalled, "The Germans were so accurate with those things, they could put one in your back pocket if they spotted you." Machine gun tracers spurted towards Nance, kicking up sand, ricocheting off beach obstacles, and stitching the hard beach with bullets. The Germans had spotted him and were zeroing in. The machine gun snarled again and again. He was definitely the target. The fire came from a bunker just to the right of the draw, halfway up the bluffs. Nance held his breath as the sound of bullets got louder. His body began to shake with terror. The bullets got so close. He had to push on. There was no retreat on D-Day. Nance slowly crawled forward, heading for a cliff face 300 yards away. Suddenly his right foot felt as if it had been hit with a baseball bat. Part of his heel had been shot away. Bullets again stitched the sand all around him. Nance lay as still as he could, hoping the machine gunner would think he was dead. But even corpses were targets for the Germans above Dog Green. Just as he was about to give up hope, he looked up at the sky, which seemed to clear slightly. A warm feeling came over him and he knew he was going to live. He then spotted a tidal pool. It looked deep enough for a man to disappear beneath its surface. Nance crawled as fast as he could, slithering into the pool's placid waters. He took a deep breath and ducked beneath the surface just as bullets pierced the strap of his binoculars case. Nance ducked down again and again, dodging incoming bullets. The tidal pool was slowly turning red with blood from his mangled foot and ankle. His adrenaline was pumping so intensely, he didn't know how long he'd been there, just that he couldn't stay there much longer. With his last bit of strength, he scrambled and crawled the final yards towards the cliff and collapsed behind the shingle. He wasn't completely safe, but at least out of the line of sight of the machine gunners. He looked out to sea. He recognized many of the dead along the waterline. Wounded men from Company A who no longer had the strength to crawl drowned as the tide crept up. He still felt responsible for them, every last one. I was their officer. It was my duty. They were the finest soldiers I ever saw. 1,000 yards from the beach, Roy Stevens and the men of the 5th LCA still managed to keep their heads above the heavy swells. They could hear the battle raging on Omaha and thought of their buddies. Muscles cramping and hypothermia setting in, they stuck close together to help one another stay afloat. Another Bedford boy and strong swimmer, Clyde Powers, had helped Roy stay afloat. Like Roy's twin, Ray, his brother Jack had landed with the rest of Company A. Finally, an LCA returning from the beach picked them up, the same one that had dropped off Captain Fellers. They headed out into the channel. Under no circumstance would they return to the beach. They were in no state to fight. They were going back to the Empire Javelin, then back to England to rearm. Lieutenant Ray Nance lay bleeding on the shingle below the seawall near the D1 draw. He was delirious and had lost all sense of time. Suddenly, a Navy medic wearing green overalls leaned over him. Nance was soaked and covered in oil and grease. The medic looked dry and clean. He knelt at Nance's side and started to examine him. He had clearly seen combat before because he handled himself calmly under fire. "This is worse than Salerno," he told Nance. The medic gave him a shot of morphine and dressed his heel wound. At some point, Nance had also been shot in the hand and again in the foot. He was one of the very lucky ones. He had million-dollar wounds, serious enough to pull him out of the war, but nothing life-threatening. The Navy medic wished him luck, then disappeared. The wounded men around Nance hadn't seen him. It was almost like the man was a figment of his imagination. But Nance knew he was real. He felt that if his Navy corpsman was heaven sent, well, that was okay with him. The 5 Bedford boys whose LCA sank 1,000 yards from the shore finally made it back to the beach 4 days later. Before joining what was left of Company A, Roy Stevens and Clyde Powers visited a makeshift graveyard lined with crosses with dog tags hanging on them. They both quickly found their brothers' names among the dead. Shocked, they didn't know what to say to each other. They walked along each avenue of crosses and found the names of all but 6 of the Bedford boys who had landed on D-Day. How could it be true? Roy felt an overwhelming amount of guilt. Why did his boat sink? Why should he be living and so many paid the ultimate price? Above all, why in God's name hadn't he shaken his twin brother's hand on D-Day before dawn? Company A sustained over a 90% casualty rate on Omaha Beach. Only a couple dozen men of the 200 weren't wounded. Over 50% were killed in action. The entire 116th Infantry suffered 797 casualties, 375 killed or missing in action. Of the 25 Bedford boys that actually landed at Dog Green Sector, 19 were killed. 6 survived the landing, 4 critically wounded. In comparison with its wartime population, Bedford suffered the nation's highest known per capita D-Day loss, a solemn distinction for the rural Virginia community. For this reason, the town was named the official site of the National D-Day Memorial, which was dedicated on June 6, 2001. And it is a fitting tribute to all those that fought and died in Normandy, but especially to those young men from Bedford whose sacrifice the town will never forget.